Sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from a declared enemy, but from someone sitting next to you who claims to be a friend. Why are there people who smile to your face but wear you down inside? Why do you feel confused, small, or emotionally exhausted after seeing them? There is an uncomfortable truth that almost no one dares to say. Some friendships do more harm than loneliness, and recognizing them in time can change your life completely. Today, we are going to discover how to identify them before it's too late. At first, it almost never seems serious. It all starts subtly, almost invisibly. That person appears in your life when you are open, when you need company, when you seek connection. They seem interested, listen to your stories, share laughs with you. And for a while, you believe you found someone special. But little by little, something begins to change. You start to notice that after talking to that person, your energy isn't the same. There's no clear argument, no direct conflict, but there is a strange feeling that keeps repeating. You wonder why it's always you who gives in, who justifies, who adapts. Why do your achievements seem to make them uncomfortable? Why do your problems never receive the same attention as theirs? This is where the real problem begins. These people don't attack head-on. They don't raise their voice or show explicit rejection. Their way of hurting is silent. Sometimes it's a joke that minimizes your dreams. Other times it's a comment that sows doubt. Little by little, you begin to question yourself without understanding why. The most dangerous thing is that this type of relationship disguises itself as normality. You tell yourself that you're exaggerating, that nobody's perfect, that that's just how friendships are. But deep down, something doesn't fit. You start to feel guilty for setting boundaries. You start to keep quiet about what you really think to avoid tension. And without realizing it, you pull away from who you really are. This is the exact point where many people lose themselves, because when the damage isn't obvious, it's much harder to defend yourself. And while you're doubting, the erosion continues. Understanding this beginning is key to understanding everything that follows. Over time, the signs begin to repeat, but they remain subtle enough to go unnoticed. They aren't direct blows, but small gestures that, in isolation, seem harmless. The problem is, they never happen just once. They accumulate. You notice that every conversation ends up revolving around the other person. When you try to talk about what's worrying you, the response is short, indifferent, or quickly diverted to another topic. You start to wonder why your emotions seem less important. Why do you always have to be strong? Why does showing exhaustion feel like a weakness? Another sign appears when you start to feel observed, evaluated. Your decisions are no longer simply yours. Every choice is accompanied by a look, a silence, or an ambiguous comment that makes you doubt. They don't tell you that you're wrong, but they manage to make you feel it. And the most unsettling thing is that you can't point to the exact moment when it all changed. These people usually present themselves as sincere, even too honest. They say they just want to help you, that they speak that way because they care about you. But behind that supposed concern, there is control. Control disguised as advice, judgment camouflaged as affection. Little by little, you begin to modify your behavior. You think twice before speaking. You adjust your words to avoid uncomfortable reactions. And without realizing it, you become smaller, more cautious, less spontaneous. Not because someone directly asked you to, but because you learned that being yourself has an emotional cost. This is where the confusion becomes dangerous. Because when there is no clear aggression, the certainty that something is wrong also disappears. And while you're doubting, the relationship strengthens, but not in equality, but at the expense of your well-being. The change doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic scene that marks a before and after. It's more silent, more dangerous. One day you find yourself justifying behaviors that you never would have accepted before, and you don't know exactly when you started doing it. You begin to think that maybe the problem is you, that maybe you're too sensitive, that you're exaggerating. Every time something hurts you, you remember their words, their gestures, their apparent calm, and you wonder why it affects you so much if, according to them, it's not that big of a deal. This is the moment when the scale breaks, because while you analyze, correct, and question yourself, the other person remains intact. They don't change, they don't doubt, they don't check themselves. And that asymmetry creates a constant sense of emotional inferiority. You begin to lose internal reference points. What seemed clear to you before now becomes confusing. What you used to call a lack of respect, you now call a misunderstanding. What was once a red flag, you now call your own flaw. Without realizing it, you have shifted the responsibility for the harm onto yourself. Fear also appears. Not an obvious fear, but a subtle one. The fear of saying something wrong. The fear of causing distance. The fear that the relationship will cool off if you express what you really feel. So you stay silent, or soften, or procrastinate. And in that prolonged silence, something essential is eroding. Your identity. You no longer react as you used to. You no longer decide from confidence, but from anticipation. You don't act out of conviction, but to avoid emotional consequences. The most unsettling thing is that all this happens while you remain convinced that the relationship is important, even necessary. Because when someone manages to make you doubt yourself, they also manage to make you depend on their validation to feel secure again. This is where the bond stops being a relationship and starts becoming an invisible cage. You don't realize the real price until the wear and tear is already deep. There's no clear bill nor a prior warning. The cost is paid in installments, in small daily sacrifices that seem insignificant, until they pile up. You begin to yield emotional space, to not tell certain things, to filter your words, to minimize your achievements so as not to generate tension. Little by little, your inner world shrinks so the other person doesn't feel uncomfortable. And without noticing it, you are the one who begins to be uncomfortable with your own authenticity. Exhaustion becomes constant. It's not physical, it's mental. It's the fatigue of always being on alert, of measuring every gesture, every tone, every silence. It's the feeling that emotional rest is no longer possible within that relationship. Even when everything seems calm, your body stays on guard. Guilt also appears, a vague, persistent guilt. You feel responsible for the emotional climate, for the conflicts, even for the other's discomfort. If something goes wrong, you assume you could have done it better, said it differently, felt less. And that invisible burden becomes heavier and heavier. Meanwhile, the bond is sustained on a clear imbalance. You adapt, you yield, you change. The other person simply is. And the more you try to preserve the relationship, the further you get from yourself. The most dangerous thing is not the obvious pain, but the normalization of discomfort. You start to think that loving means sacrificing yourself that way. That all deep relationships hurt. That feeling small is part of the commitment. And so, you justify what you never should have accepted. But there is a sign that cannot be ignored. When you imagine your life without that relationship, and you feel more relief than fear, something within you has already understood the truth before your mind has. That is the critical point. Because when the cost of staying outweighs the fear of leaving, the story enters an irreversible phase. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic scene or final explosion. The breakup begins much earlier, in silence, when something inside you stops trying. You no longer argue, you no longer explain, you no longer expect to be understood. You simply observe, and you slowly disconnect. It's a subtle but definitive change. Conversations become functional, empty of depth. You respond out of inertia, not interest. You listen, but you're no longer involved. Not because you don't care, but because you've grown tired of feeling that nothing changes, no matter what you do. At that point, an uncomfortable clarity appears. You begin to see the relationship as it is, not as you wanted it to be. You recognize patterns you used to justify, behaviors you used to minimize, words you used to forgive without question, and that lucidity hurts because it forces you to accept how long you've been betraying yourself. Fear also arises, not of the other person, but of the void, of what remains when a relationship that took up so much space no longer makes sense. You wonder who you are without that bond, what your life will be like without that constant dynamic. The fear is not of losing the other person, but of facing yourself without distractions. Paradoxically, that's when you regain small parts of your identity. You begin to remember what you were excited about before, what made you laugh effortlessly, what decisions you would make if you didn't have to ask for emotional permission. They are brief flashes, but enough to show you that you're still there. The internal conflict intensifies. A part of you wants to stay out of habit, out of loyalty, out of fear. Another part can no longer ignore the erosion, the inconsistency, the lack of reciprocity. And living divided becomes more painful than any breakup. That is the true breaking point. Not when you decide to leave, but when you understand that staying means slowly disappearing. When you realize that staying there is no longer love, but resistance. And once that truth takes root, nothing is ever the same again. Because even if the bond continues, you have already changed. And when one changes from a place of awareness, the story can only move toward an ending. The decision doesn't come with a speech or a prepared scene. There are no ultimatums or strategic tears. It arrives in silence, almost without you noticing, when you stop justifying the unjustifiable. When you no longer look for excuses for the other person or soft lies for yourself. You just know. It's not an impulsive decision. It's the result of many nights where you felt alone while being with someone. Of many conversations where you spoke without being heard. Of many times you chose to stay silent to avoid conflict. Until silence became your only language. You begin to act differently. You don't demand. You don't confront. You don't threaten to leave. You just place yourself at an emotional distance that didn't exist before. You observe clearly what used to confuse you. And that new calm, far from being indifference, is acceptance. Acceptance doesn't mean agreeing. It means stopping the fight against what is. Stopping the wait for the other person to change out of love, fear, or guilt. Understanding that no one transforms under sustained pressure, and that love isn't begged for, it's shared. The decision is solidified when you ask yourself something essential. If nothing changed, could you live like this for 5 more years? Not tomorrow? Not next month? In the long term. And when the answer is no, there's no turning back, even if you are still physically present. Guilt also appears. The feeling of failing someone, of being selfish for choosing yourself. But over time you understand that abandoning yourself to sustain a relationship is a form of slow, socially accepted self-destruction. Then you begin to prepare yourself internally, not to run away, but to close a cycle with dignity, to speak with honesty when the time comes, to uphold your decision without needing to attack or defend yourself. The decision that isn't announced is the most powerful, because it doesn't seek approval. It doesn't need witnesses, only coherence. And when that coherence takes root, the breakup stops being a threat and becomes a necessary step. From that point on, it's no longer about whether you will end it or not. It's about when and how. And above all, about not turning back once you have chosen yourself. The end doesn't happen on the day you say goodbye. It happens long before, when you understand that staying is no longer an act of love, but of fear. When you realize that you have grown toward a place where the other person can no longer, or will no longer, accompany you. The moment of closure arrives without excessive drama. There are no clear winners or guilty parties, just 2 realities that no longer fit. You speak with a serenity that surprises even yourself. Not because it doesn't hurt, but because you've already cried everything you needed to in silence. Telling the truth becomes more important than protecting a broken illusion. You explain what you feel without attacking, without reproaching. You don't need to list mistakes because the real problem was never one specific argument, but the emotional distance that became irreversible. Then comes the void, a strange space where there used to be routine, messages, plans. That void is scary, but it's also liberating. Because for the first time in a long time, you're not waiting for anything from anyone. You're with yourself. You begin to rediscover who you were before constantly adapting. You recover thoughts, desires, your own silences. Not everything is immediate or easy. There are days of doubt, nostalgia, even the urge to go back. But now you know something you didn't know before. Going back wouldn't solve anything. The true closure happens when you stop idealizing what was and start seeing the relationship in its entirety, with its beauty and its limits. When you are grateful for what was learned without romanticizing the pain. When you understand that some people don't arrive to stay, but to teach you how far you can love and where you must not. This finality doesn't turn you into someone cold. It makes you more aware, more honest with yourself, more capable of choosing relationships where you don't have to shrink yourself to fit. And then something silent but profound happens. Peace. Not an explosive happiness, but a steady calm. The certainty that you did the right thing, even if it hurt. That you chose to grow, even if it meant losing. Because sometimes, ending things isn't giving up. It's respecting yourself. And in that respect, something new begins. A life where you no longer abandon yourself so that someone else stays.